The Trump administration has responded with fury as its attempts to derail a global climate agreement have fallen short, in spite of it using all of the most powerful threats that usually work so well. So this is about the International Maritime Organization, which operates under the United Nations umbrella. As part of its net zero framework to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from shipping, it has spent the last 2 years negotiating a legally binding framework to levy charges on vessels that underperform on efficiency. The shipping industry moves around 80% of international traded goods. That leads it to contribute around 3% of the total greenhouse gas emissions. Worth noting that reports suggest that CO2 emissions went up this year, higher than ever. So yes, every 3% makes a difference. Negotiations on this had been fraught over those 2 years, but there was a breakthrough when 63 members passed the framework back in April this year, including China, Brazil, the EU, the UK and India. Just 16 countries opposed it at that point, predominantly the major fossil fuel producing nations, so no surprise there. That was then. The Trump administration, which thinks anything to do with climate change is a Green New scam, is clearly furious that they seem powerless to stop this vote going against them when it takes place tomorrow, labelling it as a European-led neo-colonial export of global climate regulations. You have to imagine those were Donald Trump's own words. It issued a threat against all countries that vote to pass the resolution. Yes, you guessed it, countries that vote for this will be hit by additional sanctions. Maybe some of them in the form of tariffs. This, after all, has worked pretty well for it in the past, and it's indicative of the nature of the beast. It's not enough to make its argument in an international forum, to then accept defeat if it should lose the argument. No. That's way too rules-based and not nearly enough might makes right. Instead, it's going to seek to throw its weight around to threaten all the countries that might be inclined not to fall in line with its demands, which is clearly aberrant behaviour. Out of nearly 100 countries that are part of the IMO, representing 97% of all global trade, 2/3 are needed to vote for the proposal for it to pass. Rather than America throwing its weight around making it less likely, it turns out that some of the smaller Pacific Island nations who had been planning to abstain from the vote on the grounds they didn't feel it was ambitious enough, well, they now are going to vote for it. It's left the administration doing what it does best, foaming at the mouth in public at the dastardly globalists. Here was Secretary of State Marco Rubio on Twitter yesterday doing just that. This week, the UN is attempting to pass the first global carbon tax, which will increase energy, food and fuel costs across the world. We will not allow the UN to tax American citizens and companies. Under the leadership of President Trump, the US will be a hard no. We call on other nations to stand alongside the United States in defence of our citizens and sovereignty. It then listed all the measures it would definitely take, including commercial penalties, additional port fees, possibly other measures that remain under consideration, such as additional sanctions, throwing toys out of pram, that sort of thing. Needless to say that all the very online MAGA warriors who have been fulminating for years about the globalists, for instance those at the World Economic Forum as well as the United Nations, all wanting to impose nefarious stuff on the God-fearing citizens of the United States of America, this was red meat indeed. Lots of them calling for the US to leave the UN because God forbid that the US should ever be in a forum with other countries in the entire world unless they're going to agree to bow to everything that President Trump ever demands. Well, in spite of all the fuss and fury, it seems that, for once, the various countries of the world are not being bowed by America's threats of sanctions, and the various countries that supported this measure before seem likely to hold their support for the final vote. Emma Fenton of the NGO Opportunity Green told the Financial Times about the agreement, "It is telling the world that climate diplomacy is still relevant. It's still ambitious, and climate multilateralism is still alive and well, in spite of the open hostility." So what does this measure actually do? The IMO says that the attempts to describe it as a global carbon tax are misleading. Are they right? Well, it rather depends on your definitions. The measures seek to incentivise ship owners to clean up the industry. It sets a global fuel standard that requires ships to gradually reduce how polluting the ship fuel can be. And it imposes a carbon price on emissions for ships bigger than 5,000 tonnes, which is expected to generate revenues of up to $15 billion per year from 2030. That weight threshold would bring more than 85% of global shipping to fall under the provision. If adopted this week, it will come into force in March 2027. And note that the charges are paid by the ship owners, not by countries. And the point of doing it under the aegis of the United Nations is to seek to avoid a proliferation of slightly different similar schemes to being operated on a nation-by-nation basis, which would be way more complicated and a lot more costly. The funds raised can go to projects to reward low-emission ships, to accelerate the reduction of emissions from shipping, as well as supporting climate-vulnerable countries. Now, you have to say that a scheme that raises money from ship owners, spends it on what is perceived to be a public good, obviously not unreasonable to call that a tax. Now, it is true to say it's not a carbon tax per se, i.e. it's not priced at a certain amount per tonnage of CO2 emitted on a consistent basis. It uses a market mechanism to incentivise efficiency, but yes, it is a tax de facto. The idea of such a scheme operated globally does cross a certain line, although it doesn't mean bingo, welcome to the era of global government. But nevertheless, you can expect some countries would not be in favour of it, such as the United States, and they have had the opportunity to argue against it. And then there'll be a vote, which seems like a reasonable system for making decisions. Well, the Wall Street Journal editorial board doesn't seem to think so. It published an editorial 2 days ago, fulminating against this in the starkest possible terms. "The United Nations is about to tax you," it said, and it played its narrative to the heart of the populist moment. Voters are showing their opposition to the net zero climate agenda whenever they get the chance. Not entirely true. It's certainly becoming a more heavily contested space wherever MAGA has influence. But that isn't stopping the United Nations, which this week is poised to impose what amounts to a global tax on carbon emissions. Yes, this is the definition of taxation without representation. Well, in this era where President Trump has been slapping tariffs on every other country, pushing up the cost of goods for Americans and for the rest of the world, by the way, some of the next bit kind of slips into the surreal. If you've heard about this at all, it's probably because the Trump administration last week threatened to slap sanctions on any country that votes in favour of imposing this tax. Washington rightly worries it will increase the cost of goods American households by increasing global shipping costs by as much as 10%. Really? Increasing global shipping costs is bad now? How fascinating. Now, to give the Wall Street Journal editors their due, they did then acknowledge the interesting contradiction. Setting aside the trade policy irony, it said, at least someone in the Trump administration is worried that expensive imports might be bad for the American economy. Who's that? The intern? Yeah, you've lost the rest of the world at this point. The world is imposing a charge on shipping because of the environmental damage that it causes, to encourage it to do less such damage, and to pay for that process of doing less damage to get faster. Now, it may or may not be the best scheme you could come up with, but are we seriously going to hold it as being more nefarious than, America just tariffing every country in the world and bullying them to buy its energy in one-sided trade deals and all the rest? just because it can, just to benefit the United States at the expense of everybody else. Yeah, where did I put that violin? Oh, and also that the US is threatening penalties in response to this measure that would also raise the costs of shipping, costing Americans, etc., etc. Yeah, it makes perfect sense. Now, the amount of money that goes into this is pretty small, so the fury coming from the administration is that it firmly believed that by strength of will, by the power of Trump's bullying, they had abolished any and all action on climate change, and they are perturbed to find out that might not be the case. It's not the amount of money here, it's the principle of the thing, bolstered by the absolute belief that it's America's place to dictate to the rest of the world, without exception, what they are and aren't allowed to do. While not counting out that sometimes in the future, they may be right about an issue. We may conclude that those wanting to go ahead with a policy that America disagrees with, they're wrong. Well, it's worth celebrating in any case that on this occasion it seems that Trump threatened and bullied, and the rest of the world just shrugged and went ahead anyway. I would say that, on its own, is a pretty healthy outcome.